What I see codependency as is like this mirror almost. So, whatever I'm codependent with, it's attached to something outside of me. So, if I'm experiencing a lack of self trust or a lack of self confidence, or my fear of abandonment or rejection or betrayal, when that comes up for us, I see these patterns as opportunities to meet ourselves more fully. And that's ultimately how we heal codependency.
Welcome to Season of Stuck, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the all too human experience of feeling stuck. I'm your host, Deanna and on this podcast, we explore all things stuck. How and why stuckness happens, what it feels like, how to learn and grow from it, and ultimately, how to get unstuck and move forward in an authentic, empowered way. If you are looking for insights, support, and community as you make your journey from stuck to unstuck, you're in the right place. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Hello. Welcome to another episode of Season of Stuck. I'm your host, Deanna. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you have ever felt stuck, whether stuck in your career or your relationship or your personal growth journey or really anywhere else, you're in the right place. And if this isn't your first time here, welcome back. Seriously, it is such a trip to me that you keep coming back week after week. So thank you for being here and tuning in. Okay, so jumping into today's topic. Today, we are going to be taking a deep dive into a pattern where a lot of people, myself included, can get stuck, and that is codependency. So what is codependency? If you do a quick Google search, you will find that codependency has a lot of different definitions. For example, an article from Psychology Today defines codependency as a dysfunctional relationship dynamic where one person assumes the role of the giver, sacrificing their own needs and well-being for the sake of the other, the taker. Wikipedia defines codependency as a theory that attempts to explain imbalanced relationships where one person enables another person's self-destructive behavior, such as addiction, poor mental health, immaturity, irresponsibility, or underachievement. And the Oxford Dictionary defines it as excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner, typically one who requires support on account of an illness or addiction. And all of those definitions are accurate. But while codependency has historically been tied to addiction, in recent years, there's really been more of an expansion of how we think about codependency. And today's guest, more on her in a bit, has a slightly different definition. And it's arguably my favorite. She defines codependency as placing your worth or your good feelings about yourself on someone or something outside of you. And that resonated with me so deeply. Because that definition doesn't just define what codependency is, it also defines the why behind it. At least the why for me. My codependency wasn't really tied to addiction. It was tied to how I felt about myself. When you peel back all of my layers and get to my core, my deepest desire is to be loved and appreciated and accepted. And for a huge chunk of my life, I tied my self-worth to being loved and appreciated and accepted by other people. Or in other words, in order to feel good about myself, I needed other people to feel good about me too. And that led to a host of what I now know are codependent behaviors. For example, I was a people pleaser to the max. I would automatically say yes, even when I really wanted to say no, because I was scared that saying no would make that person mad at me, which felt literally intolerable. If someone was upset or in a bad mood, I would immediately assume it was somehow my fault, then take responsibility for their emotions and make it my mission to quote unquote solve their mood, because I needed them to be happy so that I could be happy. I've struggled with boundaries and fear of rejection. I've sacrificed my own needs and joy and comfort to fulfill other people's expectations. I've absorbed the emotions and moods and feelings of people around me. And I have put up with a lot of what I now know is unacceptable behavior in a variety of relationships, from romantic partners to friends to family members. because I didn't know how to stand up for myself. I was completely stuck in this pattern for a really long time, and it was exhausting and sad and unfulfilling. I didn't really have a sense of who I was outside of who other people wanted me to be, which prevented me from connecting with people in a real, authentic way. So, ironically, codependency was actually keeping me from the real love and appreciation and acceptance that I wanted. It took literal years of work for me to understand how codependency showed up for me, why I leaned towards these behaviors, and how they were no longer serving me. And then even more work to start unwinding those behaviors and showing up differently in my relationships. Instead of focusing on what other people needed me to be, I started focusing on what I wanted me to be. I started setting boundaries in a way that prioritized my happiness and well-being and aligned with how I wanted to live my life. And I started saying no, which at the time felt revolutionary. And I'm not going to lie, at times it was really hard and uncomfortable. Not everyone was super on board when I started making these changes. As the saying goes, when you stop people pleasing, people stop being pleased. And as a result, I definitely grew apart from some people and a lot of my relationships changed. But the more I worked on my codependency, the more I started to develop a real sense of identity and self-worth that wasn't tied to other people or how they experienced me. I became a more real, authentic version of myself. And the more me I became, the more I was able to truly find and connect with people that loved and appreciated and accepted me for who I really am. And that has been a game changer. Now, to be clear, I'm definitely not cured of my codependency. I can still slip into codependent behaviors if I'm not paying attention or actively working on it. But I have come a long way on my healing journey. And that journey has really changed the way that I show up for myself and in my relationships. And today's guest is all about helping other people on that same healing journey. Alyssa Zander is a codependency and relationship coach and the creator of Codependency Alchemy, a podcast and membership that is designed to help people heal from codependency and step more deeply into authenticity and joy. During our conversation, Alyssa expands on her unique definition of codependency and how it shows up in our relationships with ourselves and others. We also explore where codependency comes from and why we fall into codependent patterns, how codependency can make us feel stuck, and Alyssa shares her process for starting to heal from codependency and get unstuck in the process. Let's jump into my conversation with Alyssa. Alyssa, welcome to Season of Stuck. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me on the show today.
I could not be more excited to chat with you because we are chatting about a topic that has been a focal point for the entirety of my life, which is codependency. As a recovering people pleaser and a person that I like to joke that I'm emotionally porous in that I absorb the emotions of people around me like a sponge, figuring out ways to understand codependency, heal the drivers of codependency within myself and relate to people in a different way has been like a focus of my growth. So I'm just so excited to dive into this with you because I think that codependency keeps a lot of people stuck, and understanding it and taking a different perspective can help people get unstuck. So I guess to get started, I would love for you to introduce yourself and what inspired you to start working in codependency.
Yeah. I love that you spoke to gaining a different perspective of codependency because I had no idea that I was codependent. I lived my whole life now knowing what I know about it and all of its insidious ways that it shows up in our relationships and how we relate to the world around us. It's like I only saw it through this lens of addiction. It's only socially spoken about in relation to addiction and being in relationships with people who are addicts. And it's like, okay, well, I'm not in a relationship with a person who's an addict, so I don't struggle with that. when really that's just like only one aspect and one maybe major theme that probably does take shape, but it's so much more than that. When I started learning about my codependent patterns, it was back in 2019 when I was going through a breakup, actually, with my current partner, ironically enough. But, it was this really spiritual, sort of esoteric thing that happened where I was seeing that word everywhere. And I didn't know why. Like, it was showing up in dreams, it was showing up in just like pages that I read on a website or this or that. Like, I kept hearing it everywhere. And so my journey really started with me journaling and writing codependency at the top of my journal. And this poem flowed out of me almost like a stream of consciousness. And then it was like for the first time, I was seeing it so clearly that I had been so codependent in my relationship. And that ultimately led to its demise.
I love that you brought up the fact that codependency has this kind of reputation about being an addiction thing. And I was introduced to the concept of codependency. I had a serious drinking problem in my early 20s. I stopped drinking a little over 14 years ago. And that was my entry point into codependency. But once I got in, I realized how widespread it was and how much it touched so many of my different behaviors that had nothing to do with addiction. And that once I healed from my addiction and stopped drinking, it's not like those patterns went away, right? It
Yeah.
just, they manifested in different ways. And that's so beautiful that it almost sounds like a channeling of like this information.
Yeah, it really was.
So obviously, codependency is something that we are both very familiar with, but it's not something that everyone is familiar with. So, for people listening who maybe aren't super familiar with the concept, what exactly is codependency?
I can tell you how I define codependency and how that definition has really supported me in unlearning some of the patterns that come with codependency. The way that I've identified it is codependency is when you place your worth or your good feelings about yourself on someone or something outside of you.
I literally got chills when you said that because that's such a succinct way of explaining something that feels so deep experientially, but that's exactly it. It's all of the codependent patterns that I have, that I've seen, that I've learned about are reflections of that needing to find worth externally, whether through a relationship or validation or whatever the case may be. So that is a beautiful definition. So, what are some of these behaviors that go along with codependency when you're trying to find this worth outside of yourself? How does that actually manifest?
The way that I see it manifesting the most is through some sort of external validation or attachment. I think that attachments are the perfect indicator for where you have a codependent relationship with something or someone. So the attachment could be this relationship proves that I'm lovable, that I belong, that I won't end up alone. This job proves that I am successful or good enough. The kind of car that I drive defines how well off I am. The grades that I get in school, like, show how smart I am. Like, wherever there's an attachment to something outside of you is typically where we can start unraveling or exploring what is that codependent relationship. If I didn't have this, then what am I afraid that will mean about me? If I don't have this job, what am I afraid that will mean about me? If I don't have this relationship, what am I afraid that that will mean about me? So it shows in ways that, like, we tend to override our own needs and our own desires because we believe that tending to the needs and desires of others or these statuses are going to provide us with some semblance of safety.
Like in your experience working with codependency, working with other people, where does that drive come from? That need for the external reassurance, validation, whatever the case may be?
So for me, what I have learned is that it's directly correlated to the mother wound. The mother wound is I wasn't protected or safe or loved in the way that I needed when I was a child. I think that these patterns are cultivated in the first 6 years of life. Background on me, I have my master's in early childhood education. So my primary study was working with children in developmental stages under the age of 6. It's where a lot of these unconscious patterns were created. And I want to be very clear also that even though I experience this mother wound, right, this fear of abandonment, rejection, betrayal, through not getting certain needs of protection and safety and love from my mother, it doesn't mean that my mother was unloving. It doesn't mean that my mother was unkind. Those are not necessarily synonymous. I have a beautiful relationship with my mother, and I still experienced moments of rupture in those time periods. And I found ways to get those needs met by overriding my own needs, overriding my own desires, taking care of others, taking care of her. My mom was 17 when she had me. She was a child. I was the oldest of three. So I just learned, okay, well, if I can just be a quote unquote good little girl and not cause any problems, then she'll want to be around me. If I can just take care of my siblings, she won't be so stressed out, and then she'll want to spend time with us, or she'll have the capacity to spend time with us.
My gosh, you literally just told my exact story. I am the oldest of three to parents who had me when they were very young, 18 and 20. And the role that I stepped into was to be the child that was always okay. As long as I was happy and behaving and making everyone else around me happy, then I felt safe and like I belonged. And like you said, like I wouldn't be abandoned. And I love that you highlighted that having this kind of wound, which you call the mother wound, is not about having bad parents. I think that such a powerful moment in life is the realization that like your parents are people, and that for like me, that like my parents were people who were doing their best. And there are also things, as you said, moments of rupture that can really stay with you for a lifetime if you don't address them.
Absolutely.
So, you had mentioned earlier that when you started doing this work, you didn't fully realize that you had codependent behaviors. So, for someone who's listening and hearing some of these things that may resonate, how would you recommend looking inward and saying, am I codependent? Like, how does someone know?
Take the closest things in your life, right? Whether that's a relationship, whether that's a parent, whether that's a sibling, whether that's a job, and just ask yourself, if I didn't have this, how would I feel?
Wow. That is a really powerful way to look at it. And I think that also gives insights. And I'm curious if this shows up in your work. So, when you're talking about the different ways of being codependent, like for me, thinking about like a car or like status things doesn't resonate. Like I could take those things away and feel completely fine. But for me, it's like the relationship aspect. It's this fear of not being loved, not being wanted, not being accepted, not belonging, like being on the outside. Those are the things when I think about if I were to lose my relationships or if I was to change how I showed up in my relationships that would potentially push people away. Like that,
Mm-hmm.
I just feel this feeling in the bottom of my stomach where it's like I'm on a roller coaster and about to just drop, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, do you find that with codependency, there's a connection between what people value or like their actual values in life? So, like for me, belonging and what they are codependent with.
I think it's more so a core wound, and then it just seeps into whatever is important to you. And I think that it's fluid, that it's not just one thing. Like one day it might be my relationship, but Next week, it might be my work or something along those lines. So, yes, I think it's related, but I do think that it ebbs and flows depending on what season you're at in your life or what you're pedestaling even at that time in your life. But I ultimately think the way that you relate to your job is going to be similar to the way that you relate to your relationships, because a job is a relationship in a sense. Even money, a relationship. With your children, a relationship.
So it's not so much about the thing that's the focus of the codependency. It's about that core wound then showing up in lots of different ways in your life.
Exactly. And that core wound tends to be activated or triggered depending on how safe you feel with yourself. And so when we experience codependency, there tends to be a lack of safety that we feel within ourselves. And that's why we're seeking it outside of ourselves. Our relationship then is the provider of our safety. So when we remove it, it's that pit of your stomach roller coaster feeling. Well, when that person's not there, then I'm not safe anymore.
That makes total sense. So this is a podcast about stuckness. And we're talking about a lot of these behaviors and ways that they manifest. I'd love to talk about some of the different ways that codependency and codependent behaviors can keep people stuck or hold them back. So, in your experience, how does codependency get and keep people in a stuck place?
I think the most common stuck place I see, especially speaking about relationships, is the arguing in circles. It's like the partners end up having the same fight over and over again, more or less. It's like always about this one thing. And I think where we get stuck in ways of relating in our relationships is that the person who tends to have the codependent pattern just cannot be the one that's wrong. Like we will defend ourselves or try to be understood out of a deep desire to be right, because if we're right, then you don't have a reason to leave me. If I'm wrong, then that means I'm bad. And if I'm bad, then that gives you reason to leave me. So oftentimes we can be stuck in this pattern of defending ourselves, defending our perspective, defending our truth, because we're so scared that if the other person doesn't understand us, then we'll be perceived negatively, perhaps. And then if we're perceived negatively, then that person will leave us. The alternative of that is that we'll fawn, right? You're right. You're right. I'm totally wrong. Just forget it. Like, forget I said anything. Forget I even mentioned that. These are like the two very different ways, but very prominent ways that we end up staying stuck in relationships in regards to conflicts. And ultimately, both of those ways of relating in conflicts don't have us moving the needle in our relationships at all, because we just circle in them. So, what we get to do instead is ask ourselves, what am I making this conflict mean about me?
So it sounds like the two flip sides of the coin is either abandoning yourself in favor of people pleasing and fawning over the other person you're in relationship with, or digging in your heels because the fear of being wrong or being perceived as wrong triggers all of those scary feelings of being abandoned or not being good enough or so on and so forth.
Exactly.
And that sounds like it would be really hard on a relationship.
Totally. And I notice for myself that I do both. I've done both. I've seen myself in both. And that's going to also be dependent on where my capacity is and how safe I feel. When I'm dysregulated, I do not stand up. I do not advocate for myself. I will 100% people please and fawn. But when I'm afraid of not having control, when I feel like there's a loss of control, I'll dig my heels in to try to get that power.
I also do both. And it's interesting. Like I can gauge where I am at mentally in my nervous system regulation based on how often and how I am like acting out these behaviors. And they show up differently based on relationship. So in my friendships, in my family relationships, I tend to fawn and people please and just kind of like lay down the flag and be like, hey, you're right. It's totally fine. And then in my partnership, which is the relationship where I feel the most safe, I tend to dig in my heels and go into defensive mode. So it's interesting how those things are so different, but depending on the situation, if you're a person that leans toward codependency, you could go in either direction.
Yeah, you really can. It's very common too.
Now, so codependency shows up in relationships, but the most important relationship that we'll have is the relationship with ourselves. So, what does codependency do, or how does it show up in your relationship to yourself, your self worth, self esteem, self confidence, self trust?
Yeah. What I see codependency as is like this mirror almost. So, whatever I'm codependent with, it has to be attached to something. If I experience codependency, it's attached to something outside of me. So, if I'm experiencing a lack of self trust or a lack of self confidence, or my fear of abandonment or rejection or betrayal, are those are my three most common, and those are the most common with the women who I work with. When that comes up for us, I see these patterns as opportunities to meet ourselves more fully. And that's ultimately how we heal codependency. Like the question I had just posed earlier, what are we making that conflict mean about us? What are we making speaking our truth mean about us? I just did a AMA chat in my membership this whole, like all morning, and that's such a common theme. Well, if I speak my truth, then he'll get mad. Okay. And then what are you making him being mad mean about you? Or if I ask for space, this and this and this will happen. Like we have this attachment and this story to things unraveling. And it's ultimately, it always leads back to I'll be alone. 9 times out of 10, I will be alone. So, codependency with ourselves is learning how to feel so safe and sovereign. I always say the antithesis of codependency is sovereignty, meaning I can stand alone in my being and feel confident and safe. Like I don't need my partner. I desire to walk alongside my partner, but if or when he decides that he doesn't find joy in this, unconditional love means letting that go. I get to grieve that separation. But ultimately, healing codependency is I'm sovereign, that my worthiness and my belonging and how loved I am isn't dependent on my relationship.
It sounds like the ultimate act of self love, healing codependency.
Yeah, it is. And sovereignty and autonomy and authenticity. We cannot be our most authentic expressions of self if we believe that speaking our truth will equal ending up alone. Like we have to do the shadow work and the inner child work to figure out what part of us holds that belief. And then we have to assign it a new job.
And it's a losing battle to begin with, because no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you people please, no matter how much you aim to control the moods and feelings of people around you, you can't. It's out of your control, right? You can't control how people feel about you. You can't control how people interact with you. All you can do is stand in who you are and decide how you want to move through the world and how you will react to other people dealing with you, or how you will react to people interacting with you. There are so many different ways to go from stuck to unstuck. But one of the most productive, learning. Learning something new can help you expand your skill set and find new interest, and in the process, help you get unstuck. And if you want to learn something new, you will definitely want to check out Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community that offers thousands of classes designed to help you learn, grow, and tap into your creativity, all of which can help you make the journey from stuck to unstuck. And right now, Skillshare is offering a free month to new members. If you want to access Skillshare's entire library of classes and get the education and instruction you need to shake off the stuckness, just visit seasonofstuck.com/Skillshare and sign up for your free trial today. Again, that's seasonofstuck.com/Skillshare. unstuck.com/Skillshare. So you have already touched on some questions and some things to ask yourself, but I'd love to go deeper into healing codependency and like what that means and what that looks like. And also, I guess to start things off, codependency, it's not like you heal codependency, get a gold star, a trophy, like no longer codependent, and then you're done and you walk through life forever. It's like a fluid up and down, ebb and flow type situation.
Which the codependents out there are going to hate that. They're like, wait, no, what? What's the point then? And I always say, well, the point is, how do you desire to feel? And do you feel that? Do you feel that in your life? Do you feel that in your relationship? And most people who experience codependency don't. If they're newly in codependent relationships, for example, there's a lot of feelings of anxiety. If they've been in a relationship for a long time that's codependent, then the typical thing that they're feeling is resentment because they've taken on everything. So those are like really big indicators, right? If you're experiencing a lot of anxiety, chances are you don't feel safe to authentically express yourself in your relationship. You're probably people pleasing, fawning, overgiving, self-sacrificing, which then ultimately leads to resentment, inevitably, every single time. You're not going to get out of experiencing resentment if you're in that pattern. But yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that because it's one of the first things that I tell the people that I work with who come on to like work with me or work alongside me or join my membership. Healing codependency isn't I do A and end up at B and never experience A again. It's I learn how to hold myself when A comes up again. That is what the healing journey is, period. Doesn't even have to be with codependency. But unfortunately, the way that we've seen healing is that we've pedestaled it of like, oh, if I heal, I won't experience this thing that causes me discomfort. But that's actually not the point. Healing is when I experience this discomfort, I know how to hold myself through it. And the reason why this is so profound is because when I do this work with women, when I do the inner child practice and allow them to really tend and meet that part of them that's holding this deep-seated fear that has them in the pattern to begin with, there is oftentimes what I ask them is, how does it feel now? I feel lighter. I feel joy. I feel ecstatic. I feel bliss. I feel freedom. I feel liberation. Beautiful. What did you need to experience in order to get to that? The discomfort.
They say what? What's the saying? That happiness, joy is on the other side of your comfort zone. So like you have to move through that discomfort in order to get to the good stuff.
Yeah. You can't just mute one emotion. You can't just say, hey, I don't want to feel anger and not mute yourself from feeling joy. You can't say, oh, hey, I don't want to feel sad and you mute yourself from feeling happy. Like if you numb to one, you numb to all, which is why we find ourselves in dissociation a lot. I don't want to feel that sadness, but in avoiding the sadness and avoiding the shadow aspects of ourselves, we actually avoid the more playful, excited, joyful parts of ourselves. The more shadow work I've done, the more I've sat with the parts of me that I've repressed, the parts of me that I would feel guilt and shame over, the more joy I've experienced in my life. So now when those patterns come in, when those shadow aspects of myself that say like, oh, you're not good enough, they do it better, you'll never be loved, just judgment, comparison, envy, jealousy, those parts of me are very real. Now when they come in, instead of being like, oh no, I'm not jealous, I love everyone. Or no, I don't compare myself, like everyone is amazing. Like that's just basically telling a child who has their knee cut open, oh, you're fine. Now I'm like, no, come here, come sit at the table. The way I explain it to the women that I work with is, we're inviting them in for tea. Imagine that they're like banging on the door. They're going to keep banging on that door. It's just going to get louder. Now I just open the door and say, sit down, baby girl. What do you want to share with me? What's going on? What are you afraid of? Because that's when it actually moves. And on the other side of actually sitting with it, I will experience immense bliss, like what I said these women share: bliss, liberation, freedom, gratitude, joy. it's almost like a waterfall, like just immersing you. It's so freaking sacred. And we avoid it because it's scary. We're afraid that if I actually allow myself to be in the sadness, the depression, the anger, that we'll never leave it, that we'll be stuck there forever.
For people listening that want to do this work, this shadow work, this sitting with these parts of themselves that feed their codependency, but aren't sure where to start, what would you say to them? What advice would you give?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wrote an entire Substack post on literally, it's 10 steps. And it's the 10 steps I walk myself through every time it comes up for me. It's the 10 steps I walk my clients through. It's the 10 steps that I walk the women in the membership through. I live by them. It's just questions that you get to reflect on with yourself, that you get to ask yourself. It's just really sitting and asking a handful of questions. The shadow work piece is really important because typically we're working with our mind and our mind's story, and our mind's story can get really fixated on all these details. So, like, I can get fixated on my partner not doing the dishes, and then I'm making that mean something. So, it's really like, okay, what am I making him not doing the dishes mean about me? That he doesn't care about me because I asked him to do it earlier and it's still not done. Okay. So if he doesn't care about me because they're still there, like, then what does that mean? Well, that means that he doesn't love me. If he doesn't love me, then what? That means he's going to leave me. If he's going to leave me, then what? Then I end up alone. It's like, okay, now we've gotten to the root. So I try not to fixate on the stories as much. I just got back from a trip from Hawaii and I just have been in dysregulation since I landed back home. And I was telling myself the story like, oh, this isn't right. And this isn't right. And I shouldn't live here. And I should live in Hawaii and all these things. It's like, okay, can I just take a moment to pause? What is the actual root here? Because it's not that I live in the wrong place, but that is the mirror for something deeper. What am I making living here mean about me?
And when you get to that root, whether it's, I'm afraid that I'm going to be alone, I'm afraid that I'll be rejected, I'm afraid that I'm not worthy. Like when you wade through the story and get to that core wound, the root of what's happening, what do you do? Like, how do you comfort yourself? How do you sit with that in a way that's healing and not shaming or judgmental or self critical?
Are you open to me walking you through the process?
I would love you to walk me through the process. That sounds great.
Okay, so if you have this core wound of I'll be alone, does that resonate for you?
Yes.
Okay. So, what I would ask you to do is to feel, where does the fear of being alone live in your body?
I feel it right in the center of my stomach, like under my rib cage, above my belly button, and also a little bit in my chest, in my heart space.
Beautiful. Now, try to get as many descriptive words to describe that felt sense of that fear of being alone. Does it have a color, a shape, a size, a texture, a density?
It feels heavy and dark and almost like smoke. Like I feel like this kind of smoky, like suffocating kind of texture.
Beautiful. Now I'm going to ask you, how old is this part of you? And just see if an age comes to mind. It's okay if it doesn't.
6 is what's coming up for me.
Beautiful. Now I want you to imagine yourself at 6 years old and just notice if a memory comes up or notice the environment in which the 6 year old version of yourself is in. Can you describe it?
Yeah, I'm seeing myself. When I was 6, I went to Catholic school. And so I'm seeing myself in like my school uniform. And I had these big glasses and missing some of my teeth. And yeah, I just look like I'm getting ready to go to school.
Mm-hmm. How does she seem?
She seems happy but lonely.
Mm-hmm. Now I want you to go up to her. Imagine yourself going up to her and getting down at her eye level. And I just want you to ask her, what is she afraid of?
She's afraid that she's not good enough.
Mm-hmm. What do you want her to know?
That, of course, she's good enough, that she was born good enough, and that also good enough for what? Like, there's no metric that she needs to meet, there's no award that she needs to win for like best human to ever live. Like, she just needs to be here and be present and find as much joy as she can.
Beautiful. How does she respond?
She gave me a big hug.
Oh, beautiful. I want you to ask her if she is willing to come with you. You can tell her that you're not 6 years old anymore. You can tell her how old you are. You can even show her glimpses of your life that you have lived, where you have been more than good enough, and ask her if she'll come with you.
She will. She took my hand.
Beautiful. And so now I want you to imagine yourself taking her to a safe place. And this can be a place that you've been before, or it can be a place totally made up in your imagination, just a place that feels really safe. And let me know when you're there.
I have the place.
Beautiful. Can you describe it?
So it is like this beautiful forest. Actually, it's a real place in Portland. It's in Mount Tabor Park, where there's this bench and it's surrounded by huge trees, and the sunlight is coming through the trees. It's late afternoon and it's just warm and comfortable and safe and beautiful.
Amazing. How does she seem here?
She seems good.
Good. I want you to ask her, what is it that she wants?
She wants reassurance.
Beautiful. What is it that she needs from you?
To see her, to validate her. And just when those moments come up when she feels vulnerable or not good enough or not worthy, she needs to be reminded. She needs for it to be okay to seek that reassurance.
Mm-hmm. How will she feel when she gets that need met?
Content.
Beautiful. Now, I want you to just take a moment. You don't have to do it out loud. You can if you want to, but just to give her that validation and let her know that you hear her, that you acknowledge. And if you can do that, just letting her know that you will. And you can let her know that she lives in this beautiful place in nature, in your heart space, that she is inside of you, within you, and that if she ever needs you, all she has to do is call. How does she respond?
She trusts that.
Beautiful. I like to ask that these parts of me, what would they like to do in this beautiful place in nature? What do they want their new job to be?
They want to just play and sit and read and relax.
Beautiful. I want you to ask her if she feels complete for now.
She does.
Beautiful. And then anything else that you need to close for yourself, then you can just come back when you're ready.
Uh, that was amazing. I don't know that there is anything more powerful than inner child work than going to visit those younger parts of yourself. Like, it's such a comfort to know that you can give yourself those things that you need. And what was powerful for me that came up is that, so one of my things that comes up when I am kind of engaging in codependent behaviors is I seek a lot of reassurance. Like, I will need to ask, am I being a good partner? Am I being a good friend? Like, is there anything I can do better? Am I doing a good job? Because there's this like vulnerable, insecure little 6-year-old inside of me that needs that security and that validation. But it was such a powerful reminder that I can give that to myself. That as the older, wiser, and more whole version of myself, like, I can give that to the younger versions. And that there is a future self of the person that I am working to grow into every day that can do the same when I feel that in the present.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's remembering that reassurance. It feels like that part of us thinks that it needs to come from outside of us, but she told you just very so clearly, she wants you to reassure her. What does she need from you? I didn't say what does she need from the world around her. What does she need from you? Reassurance and that validation from you. And that's how I often describe codependency is like we have this vessel in front of us, and you have a vessel, I have a vessel, your partner. And when we're trying to be filled with that reassurance and validation from our partners, what happens is, and this is the poem that I wrote that I told you at the beginning of the show, it was this exact analogy. We feel full for a moment, but it goes right out the bottom because we can't actually be filled with somebody else's essence. Their validation, their praise is a part of their essence, and it is satisfying for a moment as it goes through our vessel, but it goes right out the bottom, and then we're needing it again, and then we're needing it again, and then we're needing it again because it always feels empty because we're not feeding ourselves with our own essence. We're giving it away to everyone, but we're not giving it to ourselves. But when we start validating ourselves, when we start giving ourselves that reassurance, what ends up happening to our vessel is that it begins to fill. And that's where the analogy giving from your overflow comes in. Eventually, you will overflow. And so it doesn't mean that you cannot receive validation or praise from your partner, because inevitably you will. It's just that when you actually fill yourself up with your own essence and your own validation, your own praise, your own love, when they pour into you, you can actually receive it because you're not attached to it filling something for you because you're already full. It adds to your overflow, and then that pours out into the world around you. And the way that I like to see it is my partner and I have our own separate vessels, but our relationship also has its own. And so when we're both filled with our own essence and then we pour into each other, it actually adds to the overflow that goes into the vessel between us.
That is such a beautiful visual and way to think about it, and such a good reminder of the importance of filling your own cup and the fact that someone else can't fill your cup if you're not filling it yourself. It's like a bathtub with a drain. Like it goes right in and then drains right out.
Yep.
Wow. That's just really, really powerful. This has been, as I mentioned at the top of this podcast, this has been like a theme for me in my life. And these have been like such powerful reminders of the importance of self-love and looking inward for the things that I need to be happy and joyful and free, and not to get stuck in seeking out those things from other people, other things, other external types of validation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that this is also a place where other people get stuck. So thank you for all of those insights. I'm sure that people listening has been just as helpful as it was for me. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for allowing me to witness you in that.
Yeah. So at the end of episodes here on Season of Stuck, we do just kind of like a little round of ending questions. So if it's okay with you, I just have a few more questions for you.
Yeah.
Okay. So thinking about your ideal future self, like the Alyssa that you are working every day to grow into,
Mm-hmm.
if she could travel back in time and talk to the current version of you, what advice or insights do you think she would share with you on how to navigate stuckness at this point in your life?
Mm-hmm. The first thing that comes to mind is I just hear her saying, stick with the plan. Stick with the plan. Like I already know the plan. She's already communicated it to me. I know what it looks like. I know what it feels like. It's a very sweet reminder because ego wants to be like, oh, maybe I do that. Oh, maybe I do that. But she's just saying, stick with the plan.
What great advice. Okay, and now this next round of questions are just rapid fire. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. You just say the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
Okay. Favorite movie of all time?
Notebook came to mind.
Ooh, good. Oh my gosh. If you're a bird, I'm a bird.
Right. Talk about codependency.
Oh, that's so funny. Go-to coffee order.
Cardamom oat milk latte.
Ooh, that's so good. They're at the bakery near my house. They do cardamom buns that are like my favorite pastry ever.
There's one by me too.
And do you love them to go with your cardamom coffee?
Oh my gosh, like say less. Sign me. That's like the perfect Sunday morning. Are you kidding me?
Let me say, cardamom is something that I didn't even know existed until I started watching Great British Bake Off. And now it's like, I can't get enough. I'm like, give it to me in all the different ways.
Yes, I'm obsessed.
Okay, if you could have any animal in the world as a pet, what would it be?
I'm surprised by the first thing that came to mind. It was a snake, but I would never want a snake. I don't know why I thought that. But
Maybe
you
it's
said
like,
first thing that comes to mind, so I'm just saying it. I don't know why, but that's what came through.
there you go. Sometimes these things, like the first thing that comes up, it's like it doesn't make sense right away. And then later, once it kind of simmers, you're like, oh, that's what that meant.
Yeah.
Okay. And then last question, best concert you have ever been to?
Mm, Beyonce.
Ooh, Queen.
Yeah,
Was
at
it, did you go to,
Coachella. So yeah,
oh, at Coachella. That must have been amazing.
it was great. Yeah, I feel like that was epic for sure.
Good choice. Well, again, Alyssa, thank you so much for being here. This conversation, again, was so helpful to me. I know it will be helpful to others. For people listening that want to connect with you or work with you or learn more about your work, how can they do that?
Yeah, I would say check out my podcast, Codependency Alchemy, also my Substack, also named Codependency Alchemy. I post on social media every day, whether that's Instagram, TikTok. My podcast is a video podcast, so you can also find it on YouTube if that's your jam. The Codependency Alchemy membership is hosted on Substack. If you're just wanting resources, that inner child healing practice, it's all on Substack. I have a tab for tons of resources. What is codependency? What is shadow work? What is inner child healing? How to do it, as well as my podcast episodes with tons of resources. And I actually do 2 podcast episodes a month where I'm walking members through in the membership through the practice I just walked you through, but on their own situations that they're experiencing some discomfort around.
Incredible. So many ways to connect and learn. I can't wait to dive further into those things.
Yeah.
So, again, Alyssa, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for today. A huge thank you to our guests for their incredible insights, and a huge thank you to you, our listeners. We know that there are so many podcasts out there to choose from, and we are just so grateful that you chose ours. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider recommending the podcast to a friend or family member that you think would enjoy it. And to make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. And while you're there, if you loved the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review. It plays such a huge part in getting this podcast out to a wider audience and ultimately supporting more people on their journey from stuck to unstuck. And to keep in touch and access even more stuck-related content, follow us on Instagram at Season of Stuck and visit our website, seasonofstuck.com, where you can sign up to get episodes delivered directly to your inbox. Thank you again for being here. It is so, so appreciated. Until next time, I'm Deanna DeBera, and you're listening to Season of Stuck.